All right. Let's you and I address the elephant in the room. And no, it is not Stomper, the mascot of the A's.
Okay.
We have three 100-win teams in the National League, and none of them got to the National League Championship Series. We have two teams that finished the year sub 90 wins, and one of them kind of stumbled and bumbled their way into the postseason. And one of them is going to the World Series. There has been more than a little bit of grumbling about the fact that the current version of the Major League Baseball postseason is taking away any accomplishments in the regular season and basically putting yourself in a situation where you almost want to get into the wild card round and play those extra games so you stay fresh and don't look tired and haggard. This is not me. I'm hearing this, that this is all of a sudden, well, what's the point of the regular season if you win 111 games and get derailed in 4 days and go home and play golf? Well, clearly inferior teams over 162 games are going to be playing for a chance to win it all. I want to know your thoughts on whether or not the layoff is causing some of these great upsets or if this is just sour grapes.
Well, I do love for anyone that's pro shortening the season. I do love all these 100-win teams losing because I've heard Tim Kurchin say so many times, you need 162 games. It perfectly defines the season and takes out all the extra variables. And then you get to the postseason. It's like all these 100+ win teams are not here no more. Why did we play 162 games? Could I not got these results with 150, 140, 120 games? So that's another rant for another day. But on the rust versus rest debate, I don't know. I kind of like being the wild card team going up against that number one seed because, like, when I go back to that Phillies versus Braves series, you steal that game one, you take out the number one starter for the other team, and now guess what? Game two and game three, I got my number one and my number two starter going in that game two and game three, and now I could be up 1-0 with my two best starters yet to pitch. I just kind of like that as an idea. Yes, the extra rest is always necessary and most times helpful, but there could be a little rust baked in between because you look at that Yankee series, like they just kind of screwed over by rain. Like, of course, it's not over yet, but like the Yankees, they waited 2 weeks, they play one game, and then the MLB schedule did that weird thing where the American League the next day had the off day, and then the next time the Yankees were supposed to play, then they were rained out, so they had to miss so they basically played like one game, like 2 weeks was like really weird for them. So you could have maybe played a little rust into their debate. But I think overall, I kind of want to be the wild card series, trying to steal that game one, because if I'm able to do that, then I could be like Cleveland, where I get my Shane Bieber and Tristan McKenzie in game two and game three. I kind of just like that setup for the wild card team.
I mean, my biggest, and I mentioned this the other day, my biggest argument against that, I kept hearing a lot of people talking about that. The home team won 3 out of the first 4. So when we're talking about rest versus rust, well, Houston, New York, and Los Angeles all won game one. So there you go. I mean, yes, Houston was one swing away from losing game one. They were also, if they one swing away from losing game one and then one run scored by the Mariners in the 9th, 10th, 11th, 12th, 13th, 14th, 15th, 16th, or 17th away from losing game two. But they won those games. And you know what? If New York wins tomorrow, and they could very well win tomorrow, then guess what? Then half of the teams with home field advantage would have won. I mean, and I'm sorry, there comes a point. I mean, Atlanta did look flat in that first game, but that was more to do with the fact that Max Fried wet the bed. Julio Urias pitched fine, and the Dodgers beat the Padres handily. Garrett Cole had that one inning where the Cleveland looked like they had him on the ropes, but he wiggled out of it and wound up pitching into the 7th, and New York won that game, and the Astros rallied. So, the panic over rust versus rest to me is a little bit overrated. If all 4 home teams lost, hell, if 3 out of 4 home teams lost, my ears would be up a little more. But 3 out of 4 won.
Now,
I think that has more to do with the fact that there is a bit of a coin toss that happens in the postseason, but the better teams won 3 of the first 4 games. So how much of an effect could it possibly have been?
But do you think it's weird that it was only game one they were effective in? Because the Dodgers, their offense was great in that game one. Then the next three games wasn't quite there. The Braves, their offense was the best it was in that game one. Then the next three games wasn't there. The Astros, their biggest offensive outburst was in that game one. Then the next couple games wasn't quite there. Do you think there's any correlation to that they were able to rest? They were able to take that time off. They were all able to put it into that game one, but they weren't able to sustain that momentum because they weren't in that everyday grind and the mindset like those wild card teams that had to battle in those earlier rounds, Sully. I don't know.
I think these are all narratives that are written in retrospect.
Yeah,
I think you've seen tons of times in the history of baseball where there has been a team that is winning big down the stretch, and then they carry that winning into the postseason. It's like, oh man, that momentum carried them. And then there are instances where the teams have had rest, and then they go on and win. And then you say, oh, they were resting. The other team was exhausted. I remember a team where by the way, we have had teams in the World Series who were far worse than the teams that they played in the postseason. Back-to-back years, you had the 1987 Twins and the 1988 Los Angeles Dodgers. The Dodgers beat the 100-some-odd win Mets and the 100-some-odd win A's, and they did so with an absolute cut and paste, the worst lineup I've ever seen in the history of the World Series, because they rode Oral Hershiser's arm all the way through the postseason. In '87, the Twins, who had a negative run differential and really only two starting pitchers, but for reasons I still don't understand, had home field advantage in both the ALCS and World Series and didn't lose a single game at home and wound up winning the World Series. They lost all the road games in the World Series, and they were I think they were 6-0 at home and 2-4 on the road, and they were crowned World Series champs. And they were a fun team. They were like a softball team, but they played a Detroit team that had to battle right down to the very end. They clinched on the final day. Now, wouldn't that be a situation? The narrative happened there was, oh, Detroit was tired. They were beat. It was such a brutal fight to get to the ALCS that they wound up losing to Minnesota. Same thing with Atlanta and San Francisco were fighting all the way through the end in 1993, and they wound up losing to Philadelphia. And retroactively, we said, Philadelphia was exhausted from the pennant race with San Francisco. Oh, but when the upset happens, it's like, oh, you see, you need to be playing right up until the end. So, I mean, these are all retroactive narratives. And I think that's it's a little. I've always been for cutting back the season because I think just casual baseball fans stop watching around Labor Day, and I would rather see 130 game season, maybe with fewer injuries, and those home run records are secure. And if someone gets 62 home runs in 130 games, you tip your hat to them. And then you play the bulk of the postseason in September when the weather is eerily similar to baseball weather. And then you have the final week, the World Series is played in the first week of October. So you still get to play in October. It still means something. But when it was 162 games, but only a very few number of teams got into the postseason, the randomness of the postseason seemed more justified because only the best 4, 4, or 6 teams got into the playoffs. But now if they're going to have so many teams in and the randomness of it kicks in, then it may seem less unfair if we have the sample size be shorter. People's interest drops around Labor Day anyway. So then at that moment you say, hey, that's the end of the season, except for the postseason. And then people will continue watching their teams in the postseason. And those who don't will wind up watching football anyway.
Yeah, because like watching the D-backs last year with 50 wins, by the time we got to the All-Star break, those last 3 months were meaningless. But something that's on the same vein spiritually that I want to talk about as well, because it related to that Yankees versus Cleveland series when we're talking about the games being rained out. why doesn't every stadium get a retractable roof like Chase Field where you could close the roof on days where it's raining or snowing and you don't have to worry about that? Because they're saying one of these games with the Cleveland Yankees, we might have midges come back. I think it was supposed to be this game 4. I don't think we saw any midges in Cleveland.
No,
but
they weren't allowed in.
yeah, but who wants to deal with that? Who wants to deal with these extra elements and the rain and the coldness? Like, let's get a retractable roof. We can still get the panels like how we have at Chase Field, still get some natural sunlight. It's going to be a controlled environment, 72 degrees. There's going to be no, slippery bats, slippery balls. Like, I want to perfectly execute a game. I don't want there to be any other variables or reasons why my team might not perform or anything like that. I don't want the weather to affect my sport. I want it to be played on a neutral field. So please, let's bring retractable roofs to every stadium in Major League Baseball.
I have no problem with that.
Right.
There are two conflicting things. I want to end on this. There is the argument that the interest in the regular season would dip if it's clear that, hey, you can win 111 games, it doesn't matter. But conversely, the fight to get that final wild card spot has now become even more coveted, because you can point to the fact that instead of being like if you're fighting for the final spot in the NBA playoffs, congratulations, you're going to get swept. But
yeah.
I mean, let's face it, with very few exceptions, the NBA is the hardest sport to see upsets in the first couple of rounds. They may be upsets in the conference finals or in the finals, but in those first few rounds, they're unwatchable because it's just a massacre.
Mm-hmm.
And, it doesn't come. The NBA players don't get watchable until the second round. That's really when things. Okay, now it gets interesting because we've gotten rid of all those other things. But in baseball, if you say, "Hey, you try to get that third wild card spot," you could wind up in the NLCS. There's instead of, yeah, great, we made that, we got swept out of it. Who cares? Oh, wait a minute, look what Philadelphia did. And so, to me, yeah, it may stink if you're a Los Angeles fan or a Mets fan or an Atlanta fan who saw your team have an amazing 100-some-odd win regular season only to get smacked in the face. But if you're a Philadelphia fan and you're floundering around and Girardi gets fired and everything, you can still say, hey, wait a minute. If we get hot, we can get that other spot and roll the dice. And I'm all for that if that makes teams start spending money and being competitive.
Yeah, because that's the weird thing about the MLB playoffs. It's a series like how it is in the NBA, but it's more unpredictable like how it is in football, where even though we're doing a 5-game series, a 7-game series, it's anybody could win the series like how it is in football, where it's only one game and it's a coin flip. Even though we have the Dodgers and the Braves winning 100-plus games, those series are still coin flips because the Padres are still loaded with talent. The Phillies are still loaded with talent. And really anything can happen in the MLB postseason. Your team just has to get hot. And we've seen that with the Phillies this year. We talked about the Red Sox. I talked about the Red Sox earlier on this podcast about sometimes if your offense just gets hot, you could just mash your way to a series win. You don't really have to do much. Your pitching doesn't have to do much. If you're just going to put up 7 runs a game for 4 straight games, you're probably going to win that series. So that's what we've seen from teams like this, from this Phillies team, this Padres team. I think they're just doing it with guts and confidence right now. And they basically just took on a different mentality, which was crazy in this playoff postseason against the Dodgers team, because you would have felt like if you didn't know how these two teams faced against each other in the regular season, you would have thought the big brother was the Padres in the series with the way they took it back. So I love that these two teams are in the championship series because I think it's going to be a real fun time, Sully.
And it's always a fun time when Millard Thomas stops by. Locked On MLB. Tell people where they can follow your show.
Yeah, follow me on Twitter at CreatorThomas24 for my personal account. Follow Locked On Diamondbacks on both Twitter and Instagram for the podcast handle. We're on YouTube, of course, Locked On Diamondbacks on there. And, of course, we're on all your podcasting platforms.
And you can find us at Locked On MLB Pods, both Twitter and Instagram. Follow us on YouTube, and you can follow me on Twitter. I'm at Sully Baseball there, and on Instagram at Sully Baseball Podcast. Well, we got one more game in the division series, and we're going to figure out which one of the American League teams is going to fight for the right to take on a sub-90 win team in the World Series for the second straight year from the National League. This has been Locked On MLB, Locked On Diamondbacks crossover. I'm your host, Paul Francis Sullivan. That's Millard Thomas. Let's fist bump and call it a show. Hey, get in there. Get in there. Get in there. Get in there.